Yanyin Canon 2. Well, I don't have anything witty to say about this IM, so let's just get to the review. Canon 2 comes in a simple cardboard box. Inside the box, you would find a leather box that stores both the IMs and the cable. 3 pairs of silicone ear tips are stored in a smaller plastic box hidden underneath the paperwork. The packaging is quite efficient and effective. The cable is decent with a 4-wire design and metal hardware. Personally, I'm more impressed by the leather carrying case. It's quite enjoyable to hold and use. The earpieces are medium in size and constructed from a black resin. The yellow leathers and the color-coded fans are quite reminiscent of the Elysian Acoustic Labs Diva 2023. Similar to that IM, Canon 2 also features metal nozzles, though the size of the nozzles are much more agreeable. Due to the more restrained size of the earpieces and nozzle, Canon 2 should be more comfortable to wear for most people. Unfortunately, my ears do not seem to work very well with these IMs. I found the nozzle angle to be slightly off, preventing the IM from lying flat against my ears. I also experienced slight pressure buildup. So when you use this IM, I would recommend using shorter and smaller ear tips because the nozzles are slightly longer than usual. We start a subjective impression with vocal music from Pentatonix. When I listened to the opening song of the album, Bohemian Rhapsody, my first impression was how muscular the presentation is. Even with the least basic configuration, Canon 2 was still able to highlight the bass line of AV. The kick drum created by Kevin's beatboxing also sounds punchy and dynamic. At the same time, the bass does not overpower the rest of the mix. Canon 2 does not have a squeaky clean bass line, but I did not detect any smearing or bluntness. The mid-range vocal of Mitch and Scott also present in the mix. On the other hand, the soprano line of Kirsten is less highlighted and requires a bit more effort to separate and follow. On voices sound full and natural. The details are also good, though I did find myself wanting a little bit more texture and nuances. Let's move on with Madison Violin Concerto, performed by James Ernest. Again, Canon 2 provides a muscular presentation. I particularly enjoy the rumble and the physical sensation from the cellos and double bass. The rest of the orchestra sounds natural and pleasing. However, I'm not entirely happy with the slight hollowness in the tonality of the violin, as if there's a slight imbalance and overemphasis in the upper mid-range. I found myself constantly turning the volume up to hear more body and details in the violin, and then quickly turning down the volume to avoid the shrillness when the violin and the woodwind section plays louder together, such as around the 5-minute mark. Next, we come back to pop music with a live performance by Ed Sheeran. All of the previous pros and cons are carried over. Canon 2 provides a strong bass response. The kick drums are particularly thumpy, with clean note attack. My only criticism here is the slight lack of texture at the decay end of the bass notes. Moving on to the mid-range, I found Ed Sheeran's voice to be dominating in the mix and plays quite forward. Again, I hear a slight imbalance toward upper mid-range, leading to occasional clairs and shoutiness. Turning up one of the tuning switches can balance the mid-range to a certain degree, but the upper mid-range glare and shoutiness are still there. The treble is present but not highlighted within Canon 2. On the plus side, I did not hear any treble harshness or sibilance. In order to have a closer look at the resolution, I listened to the Four Seasons Violin Concerti by Antonio Vivaldi. I was not immediately impressed by the resolution of Canon 2. In fact, my first impression from dancer music such as the third movement of the Summer Concerto, was that Canon 2 makes it a little bit harder to follow individual instruments. Upon closer listening, my impressions improved. It seems that Canon 2 favors coherency and integration rather than the separation of instruments. I found that instruments do not smear onto each other. It's just that there is not a lot of space between them, and the instruments do not pop out with laser-sharp definition. On the plus side, I appreciate the extra details and texture from the cello and contrabass, which are barely audible with other IAMs such as the Moondrop Blessing 2. For the Soundstage test, I listened to the live album by Hans Zimmer. At a glance, the soundstage of Canon 2 does not seem to be very special because it does not push the center of the mid-range back and away from the head. However, the soundstage of Canon 2 becomes much more interesting when the music becomes more complex with distant background elements such as the choral sections. With this music, Canon 2 can show a clear separation between foreground and background elements. At times, it can create a convincing illusion that the background elements come from outside the head stage. In direct comparison, I found the depth illusion of Canon 2 to be a solid step ahead of IAMs with flatter soundstage, such as the Moondrop Blessing 2. The sound signature of Canon 2 aligns with the Harman in-ear target, but with some useful modifications. The mid-bass is boosted above the target, giving Canon 2 that muscular presentation. Interestingly, Canon 2 traces the frequency response of the Diva 2023 closely from above 300 Hz. Zooming into the mid-range, we can see that Canon 2 pushes the frequencies around 1.5 kHz forward comparing to the target. This tuning choice partially explains why vocals and instruments are more upfront with Canon 2. Luckily, the upper mid-range was dialed down a bit to avoid making the mid-range too intense. This tuning choice also helps Canon 2 avoid the harshness and shoutiness that is common amongst IAM tuned according to Harman target. The subtle warmth in the tonality of Canon 2 can also be explained by the more subdued upper mid-range. The treble of Canon 2 does not roll off early. It is relatively smooth with no problematic peak and dip. The bass of Canon 2 changes depending on the tuning switch. In general, the more switches you turn on, the warmer and bassier Canon 2 becomes. Here's a closer look at how the switches change the tonality of Canon 2. When all the switches are down, Canon 2 sounds cleaner and thinner. When all the switches are up, Canon 2 sounds warm and bassy. As I mentioned previously, Canon 2 favors coherency and integration rather than the separation of instruments. So even though instruments do not smear into each other, their placement and separation are not laser sharp. On the plus side, Canon 2 does a good job at presenting the details and texture in most instruments in the mid-range, even though it lacks a last bit of micro details and nuances that I expect coming from something like the Andromeda 2020 and the U12T. In direct comparisons, I found Canon 2 to trade blows with Moondrop Blessing 2, though I prefer the way Canon 2 presents the violins with more weight and depth due to the extra bass. So in conclusion, I would say the resolution of Canon 2 sits somewhere between Moondrop Blessing 2 and Andromeda, this level that I consider to be good. When it comes to soundstage imaging, again, Canon 2 favors coherency and integration rather than separation. However, with the right kind of recording, this IM can still show a convincing sense of depth and sell the illusion that the background elements come from outside the head stage. In summary, I found the soundstage imaging of Canon 2 to sit between the level of Blessing 2 and Andromeda. It lacks the incisiveness and layering of Andromeda and above, but it is commendable in terms of how 3D it can present the soundstage, especially comparing to other good performers like the Blessing 2. In conclusion, Yanyin has done quite a few things right with Canon 2. I particularly enjoy the muscular presentation that works well with both modern commercial music and classical recordings. Its warm tonality is pleasant without veering into muffled or muddy territory. The switches on the IM contributes meaningfully to the sound adjustment. The mid-range also stands out with commendable texture and detail. While Canon 2 IM does have some great qualities, it does show a bit of hollowness in the mid-range with certain recordings. For me, I also wish that this IM has a sharper separation and better note definition. So, should you get Canon 2? If you haven't got a competent IM in this level and price bracket, this IM is a worthy candidate for your collection. However, if you already have some competent IMs, Canon 2 does not offer many compelling reasons. In many ways, this IM highlights the challenge of the current hyper-competitive market. Don't get me wrong, Canon 2 is a good IM, but being good in a market filled with good options is a tricky position to be.